Welcome. This is the third in a series of videos that address the DoD concerns about a phenomena that's occurring with unidentified aerial phenomena. Some of the concerns that they have to do with mind control. So what this video is about, it's going to address directly those concerns. We're going to be talking about MK Ultra. We're going to be talking about Montauk. We're going to be talking about Brookhaven, mind control, as well as time travel. Some of these things are extremely controversial, but we'll take them head on and we'll address those controversies. To review, the DoD said they're concerned about three main areas: penetration of their U.S. facilities, influencing their decision makers, and compromising our national security. We won't go over all of those because we did that in the first two videos, which you probably should go back and review. But we will focus in on the last two and to discuss what might be at least one or some of those entities that they may be afraid of. Let's first take a look at the birthday cake. The birthday cake is made up of the Philadelphia experiment, MK Ultra, Brookhaven, and Montauk. Now, keep in mind that at least two of those, the Philadelphia experiment and Montauk, are extremely controversial, and the government has gone to lengths to try to keep us moving right along and not really paying any attention to those particular areas. But this video will address them directly. The Philadelphia experiment was an experiment at invisibility of a battleship. We're going to be talking about it in detail. MK Ultra was an illegal attempt to try to get to mind control, but they resulted in extremely cruel tactics, and they got shut down. When they got shut down, they moved to Brookhaven National Labs, which was a waypoint for MK Ultra, and it also was a jumping off point to go to Montauk. Montauk was an abandoned SAGE radar site on the end of Long Island, New York. And there they perfected mind control and accidentally discovered time travel. They also found that they could create objects simply with their minds. Very controversial. The Philadelphia experiment. Now, if you believe Wikipedia, which is this part up here in this write-up, Wikipedia says it's just a legend. It's just a story that was invented by Carl Allen in 1955, sent to the Naval Research Office, had some writings in the margins of a book that was in the package that they sent, that Carl sent to the Naval Research Office. He referred to himself as gypsies, writing in the margins, and they talk about alien ship propulsion and all kinds of things like that, including the time travel occurrence in the Philadelphia shipyards. Well, you can imagine people kind of bought that story when they'd read that book. In fact, somebody wrote a book on it, and then somebody made a film about it. Other people saw it, turned into a movie, The Philadelphia Experiment. All the while, people like Wikipedia saying that this is just a legend gone astray. This is just an idea by Carl Allen that's gone astray. And yet there are people that show up that swear to say this is the truth. Well, in fact, one of those people I watched a video just the other day by Phil Schneider. You know, Phil Schneider, just a minute about him. His father was a U-boat commander during the war. He was captured in France and turned over to the United States. Came over here and was given a clearance and allowed to work on some pretty esoteric equipment. One of those things that he worked on, according to Phil Schneider's father, was the Philadelphia experiment. They sent him to Philadelphia to work with Nikola Tesla to try to get a battleship to be invisible to radar. Very interesting story. Phil claims that his father told him that on his deathbed. A couple weeks before he died, he brought his kids around the bed and he told them that story. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because according to Wikipedia, there's nobody was around to tell the story. And it appears that Phil Schneider said that's exactly what happened. There was a time vortex that nobody expected. They expected just the battleship just to go out of sight from radar. That's all they expected. But it went out of sight, period. And so that was the big takeaway from Philadelphia. So Wikipedia can say all day long that it never happened, but there are people running around, including Phil, that say, oh yes, it did happen. So the legend was born, and it was embellished over the years, obviously. And the USS Eldridge, which was the name of the ship, went into an alternate reality, and in a matter of minutes it had entered a time travel vortex, returning to a disastrous conclusion for the crew. The good news was that they had accidentally discovered time travel. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it at face value and we're going to run with it. You can decide for yourself. You can read books. There are other books on this subject, and there are movies on this subject. And there are people that say they were there in 1944. So you can take that for what it's worth, but we are going to build on that because it does come back into the picture a number of years later. Let's talk about cognitive manipulation, messing with somebody's mind. Back around the Korean War time, our guys were coming back, disclaiming America, saying that America was no good and that communism was the way to go. Many of them even stayed over there in Korea and had families. And we started to look at ourselves and to ask the question, how did the Koreans do that? How did they get into their brains and turn them around like that? How did they do that? And the CIA back in the early days, early 50s, they started a Project Artichoke. We were very innocent objective, and that was to study brainwashing. What is it? How does it work? How can we do it? How can we withstand it? How can we tell our soldiers how to prepare for it? Another project right after that, Project Bluebird, tried to do the same thing. And by 1953, the CIA took Project Bluebird full bore, calling it MK Ultra, and proposed the documents shown on the screen. It said that we want to continue the research on the problems having to do with stimulus responses and those relationships in biological systems. We want to be able to install permanent septal electrodes, that is, putting things up people's noses permanently to inject them with various signals of electricity and whatever else, drugs. They wanted to investigate about using chronic electrode preparation coupled with selected classical types of conditioning. Studies will be conducted on the geography of the brain and selected species of animals. So they wanted to find out where was the locus in which the stimulations could produce specific reactions. This is what they were looking for. They said, in their proposal, they said, we will look at what the Russians are doing, we'll look at what other foreign services are doing. We won't reinvent the wheel, but we want to be given the go-ahead to begin MK Ultra. So while it started off rather innocently, it had some dark overtones with regard to getting into the brain. Some of the LSD research from MK Ultra found its way at Brookhaven National Laboratory in Long Island. And in fact, here's a draft document that basically approves the funding for that LSD research at Brookhaven from June 9th, 1953 until September 11th, 1954. And they fully planned to go in and look at as much of the effects of LSD as they could and any other related drug, including LAE, which is estrogen that they actually were injecting into people to see what it would do, which now has been discontinued, by the way. So here we go. We have a very innocent start to the question about brainwash. We have some ideas about what they want to do, and then the other layer of darkness is laid on top of that talks about LSD. And the idea here is that they evidently had planned to give LSD to unexpectedly to innocent people to see their reactions and to record it. So things started to get just a little bit dark at that point. MK Ultra, from 1953 to when it was shut off in 73. Wikipedia, in the white here, Wikipedia said it was an illegal human experimentation program designed and undertaken by the CIA. And among other things, it had to do with brainwashing and psychological torture. Brainwashing and psychological torture. MK Ultra used numerous methods to manipulate subjects, including cognitive mental states, perceptions and brain functions, such as consciousness, the covert administration of psychedelic drugs, including LSD and other chemicals. They used electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and of course some verbal and sexual abuse. Very frightening, but that was the CIA in the 50s and the 60s. They were basically uncontrolled at that point. They were doing things that nobody would ever want them to do and not getting approval from anybody. They may have started with good intentions, but it quickly got into a very negative spiral. And finally, the U.S. Congress got word of it in the Church Committee, Senator Church, looking into this thing, and 73 said, stop it. Stop everything you're doing. Well, they kind of knew that that was coming. So a couple years even before 73, they had already destroyed most of MK Ultra documentation, planning, anything that would point a finger at a certain person to blame them for this. So by the time Church came around and turned off MK Ultra, he was pretty well under a rock at that point. In fact, to be more specific, it was under a rock at Brookhaven National Labs. Let's talk a little bit about one of our national treasures, Brookhaven National Laboratory in Long Island. It's managed by Stony Brook University. And Stony Brook University, just as a side comment, is the same university that grants PhDs to microbiologists that work in S4 on alien research. It's also managed by Battelle. The Battelle Institute is the institute that gets outer worldly material turned over to it for research. So isn't there there's kind of a connection there, and it adds a little suspicion to the very nature of what BNL does. But it does belong to the Department of Energy, established in 1947. It includes nuclear research. It has a collider, a heavy ion collider. There's a picture of it there. Very extensive campus, very much involved with thousands of scientists and researchers. Very heavy-duty place. They study bioscience, nanoscience, and of course national security. They've won at this point in time, they won 7 Nobel Prizes for their work at Brookhaven. And obviously they had a lot to do with the Manhattan Project when we first invented the atomic bomb. And they had the CIA knocking at their door in 1973 to take over and let them have a home for MK Ultra. Though you didn't call it MK Ultra, they called it Project Phoenix. But they took residence in BNL. And it wasn't too long after that that they decided that they couldn't exist as a kind of a broken away project like that. They had to have funding and they had to have some support other than just hanging out at BNL. So they went to the military and they said to the military, they have a device that can change people's minds, that can mess with the enemy's minds and make them want to not fight you in a war. Would you like us to continue development on that device? And the military said, great. That sounds great to us. Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to make it a black project. We're going to have to keep it from Congress because they don't want us to do this. The military said, okay, let's make it black. And we'll fund it under black money. But we're not going to do it at Brookhaven. It's too open. It's too visible. We need a little bit less transparency. And the military said, we do have an abandoned radar site right down the road called Montauk. It's been decommissioned. Most of the equipment's still there. Buildings are all barricaded and deactivated, condemned, so to speak. Why don't we move down there? And that was the conclusion. What we're talking about here is basically MK Ultra under a rock, slithering from Brookhaven into Montauk Air Station. If this was a carnival There would be a carnival barker at this point telling you to move right along and don't pay any attention to the little antenna on the hill. There's nothing there. There's nothing to see. Keep moving right along. That's the official position of the Montauk project. Never happened. Never will. Somebody's imagination is all. The Montauk project, according to Wikipedia, is a conspiracy theory that alleges that there were projects at Montauk for the purpose of developing psychological warfare techniques and exotic research, including time travel. Imagine all that poppycock. Nothing to it at all. The story of the Montauk Project originated in the Montauk Project series of books by Preston Nichols. Preston he claimed to be an electrical engineer. He wasn't, but he was a genius in electronics and transmitters and receivers. He wrote a book, wrote a movie, wrote other kinds of things, and got people to believe it is true. And according to Wikipedia, the primary topic of the Montauk Project had alleged activities of time travel, teleportation, mind control, contact with extraterrestrial life, would you believe, and staging a faked Apollo moon landing. And all the time clinging to some of the technology that was discovered in 1943 in Philadelphia, according to Wikipedia. So you can either keep moving along and not pay any attention to that humongous sage radar at the top of the hill at Montauk Point in Long Island, or you can entertain yourself for a moment and think, what could you do there with regard to exotic research and psychological warfare, time travel, teleportation, mind control, and extraterrestrial contact? And by the way, there is a very credible rumor, credible in that there are many people telling the story, including victims themselves, that young boys were kidnapped and held in cages in the underground under Montauk for experimentation. It's a little bit more than a rumor, but your carnival barker would have you move right along and not pay any attention to that. Kind of sad. All right, let's try to make some sense out of this by putting this together. You recall we started with brainwashing, conducted basically by the CIA in the project MK Ultra. Started off very innocently and looking at interrogation techniques. That is, if you're a prisoner of war and you're being interrogated, how can you withstand that interrogation? For one thing, this would have been an honorable conclusion of MK Ultra, but they didn't go down that route. MK Ultra went down the route that said, how can you empty the human mind, make it a vegetable? They went down the route that says, how can you reprogram it? Once it's been emptied, how can you make it a different individual? Which is what they were seeing when the prisoners were coming back from Korean War. And once you're looking at reprogramming the human mind, you could have gone one of two ways. You could have looked at correcting mental deficiencies, using that reprogram in a positive way, or you could have looked at it to create dedicated spies, that is, to create people that were totally dedicated to whatever mission you wanted to tell them to be dedicated to, and if necessary, go, lose their life in accomplishing a mission. That's the road the CIA took. They didn't take the beneficial side. They took the destructive side. And in the case of emptying the human mind, they could have gone down the road and said, arrest certain mental illnesses. They could have been very productive in that area. They chose to eliminate sensitive secrets. So they would take people that had been at Montauk, for example, and clear their brains of secrets they didn't want them to tell. Be that as it may, all of this ended in Montauk, where Brookhaven initially was involved in the transfer from Brookhaven to Montauk. The philosophy itself, of course, was developed by the CIA, but it utilized some of the Philadelphia experiment, time travel technology, as well as it had its own SAGE radar, and it utilized that radar. It had the Army reprogram the frequencies of that radar to tune it into about 4 megahertz, which talked to the human brain. So we had an electromagnetic mind control project sitting there waiting for someone to use it. And in the process of using it, the story goes, they accidentally, just like in Philadelphia, bumped into time travel using electromagnetic pulses and rays from a microwave, basically. So that's the overall picture. And that is what we are talking about in this video, that the DoD is afraid that there's an entity out there that can control our minds and can get into things that we wouldn't want them to get into. And they're afraid that that science that they say exists could easily be picked up by an enemy of the United States, and they are worried. So returning to the DoD memo, the two areas that we said we're going to look at in this video were how can decision makers in our military and our government be influenced, and how can national security be compromised with regard to learning our protocols, our processes, and our secrets and our codes. Well, we pretty much have looked at the science that could do that. After knowing that we had that capability back in the 70s, it's extremely easy to extrapolate where we were to where we could be today in the process of technology being able to be intrusive into cognitive processes and into reading our minds, basically. Telling the two aspects here. The one is influence. It comes from commanding, telling the brain what to do, and removing memory. And the other aspect of that is to compromise national security in the process of mind reading, to find out what emergency procedures are in place, what is somebody supposed to do when something occurs, what kind of codes and protocols are protected and stored away and never to be told. So we have a way to influence the mind through cognitive manipulation, and we have a way to assess and to able to read the mind to compromise our national security. That's what the DoD is concerned about. And now you know why they're concerned, because it doesn't take an entity from Alpha Centauri or anywhere else to be able to do these things, because we just got through looking at a process done by humans on the earth, removed from our Congress and our president in the black world. And they were able to do anything they wanted to do, including these 2 bullets. If I were the DOD, I'd be worried too, wouldn't you? If you want to know more, I would advise you to check out the Montauk project, references stated on this page, as well as the many videos of Phil Schneider before he was strangled to get to death with a piano wire, before he told all his secrets. You can find a lot of that stuff on Paranormal X, or simply by doing searches for the names Phil Schneider. I'm Dave Fashionpour. I needed to do this in response to the DOD's concern for some kind of an unknown entity out there that's coming to get us. This is my response to that there's a little bit more mundane solutions to that concern, and there's a lot of things that we've not been told that we need to be told. And now the ball's in your court. Do what you got to do to assist us in being less concerned about this threat. Thanks a lot.